Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. On Snoozecast, we read excerpts from public domain works and occasionally original stories. We'd like to thank our listeners. If you enjoy our show, please review us on Apple Podcasts and also share it with a friend. The best place to listen to us is on our website, snoozecast.com. That way you can play a single episode and fall asleep without another one automatically playing. This episode is supported by fluffy, soft pillows waiting for your head. Tonight, I'll be reading the opening to a 1918 collection of essays titled Mysticism and Logic by Bertrand Russell. Russell, a Nobel Prize winner, is one of the world's best-known authorities on logic. In it, he challenges the romantic mysticism of the 19th century, positing instead his theory of logical atomism. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Mysticism and Logic. Metaphysics, or the attempt to conceive the world as a whole by means of thought, has been developed from the first by the union and conflict of two very different human impulses, the one urging men towards mysticism, the other urging them towards science. Some men have achieved greatness through one of these impulses alone, others through the other alone. In Hume, for example, the scientific impulse reigns quite unchecked, while in Blake, a strong hostility to science coexists with profound mystic insight. But the greatest men who have been philosophers have felt the need both of science and of mysticism. The attempt to harmonize the two was what made their life, and what always must, for all its arduous uncertainty, make philosophy, to some great minds, a greater thing than either science or religion. Before attempting an explicit characterization of the scientific and the mystical impulses, I will illustrate them by examples from two philosophers whose greatness lies in the very intimate blending which they achieved. The two philosophers I mean are Heraclitus and Plato. Heraclitus, as everyone knows, was a believer in universal flux. Time builds and destroys all things. From the few fragments that remain, it is not easy to discover how he arrived at his opinions, but there are some sayings that strongly suggest scientific observation as the source. The things that can be seen, heard, and learned, he says, are what I prize the most. This is the language of the empiricist, to whom observation is the sole guarantee of truth. The sun is new every day is another fragment, and this opinion, in spite of its paradoxical character, is obviously inspired by scientific reflection. And no doubt seemed to him to obviate the difficulty of understanding how the sun can work its way underground from west to east during the night. actual observation must also have suggested to him his central doctrine, that fire is the one permanent substance of which all visible things are passing phases. In combustion we see things change utterly, while their flame and heat rise up into the air and vanish. He says, "This world, which is the same for all, no one of gods or men has made, but it was ever, is now, and ever shall be, an ever-living fire, with measures kindling and measures going out. The transformations of fire are, first of all, sea, and half of the sea is earth, half whirlwind. This theory, though no longer one which science can accept, is nevertheless scientific in spirit. Science, too, might have inspired the famous saying to which Plato alludes, "You cannot step twice into the same rivers, for fresh waters are ever flowing in upon you." But we find also another statement among the extant fragments. We step and do not step into the same rivers. We are and are not. The comparison of this statement, which is mystical, with the one quoted by Plato, which is scientific, shows how intimately the two tendencies are blended in the system of Heraclitus. Mysticism is, in essence, little more than a certain intensity and depth of feeling in regard to what is believed about the universe. And this kind of feeling leads Heraclitus, on the basis of his science, to strangely poignant sayings concerning life and the world, such as, "Time is a child playing draughts. The kingly power is a child's." It is a poetic imagination, not science, which presents time as a despotic lord of the world, with all the irresponsible frivolity of a child. It is mysticism, too, which leads Heraclitus to assert the identity of opposites. "Good and ill are one," he says, and again, "To God all things are fair and good and right, but men hold some things right and some wrong." Much of mysticism underlies the ethics of Heraclitus. It is true that a scientific determinism alone might have inspired the statement, "Man's character is his fate," but only a mystic would have said, "Every beast is driven to the pasture with blows." And again, "It is hard to fight with one's heart's desire. Whatever it wishes to get, it purchases at the cost of soul." And again, "Wisdom is one thing. It is to know the thought by which all things are steered through all things." Examples might be multiplied, but those that have been given are enough to show the character of the man. The facts of science, as they appeared to him, fed the flame in his soul, and in its light he saw into the depths of the world by the reflection of his own dancing, swiftly penetrating fire. In such a nature we see the true union of the mystic and the man of science, the highest eminence, as I think, that it is possible to achieve in the world of thought. In Plato, the same twofold impulse exists, though the mystic impulse is distinctly the stronger of the two, and secures ultimate victory whenever the conflict is sharp. His description of the cave is the classical statement of belief in a knowledge and reality truer and more real than that of the senses. Quote, Imagine a number of men living in an underground cavernous chamber with an entrance open to the light, extending all along the entire length of the cavern, in which they have been confined from their childhood, with their legs and necks so shackled that they are obliged to sit still and look straight forwards, because their chains render it impossible for them to turn their heads round. And imagine a bright fire burning some way off, above and behind them, and an elevated roadway passing between the fire and the prisoners, with a low wall built along it, like the screens which conjurers put up in front of their audience, and above which they exhibit their wonders. "I have it," he replied. "Also figure to yourself a number of persons walking behind this wall, and carrying with them statues of men and images of other animals, wrought in wood and stone and all kinds of materials, together with various other articles, which overtop the wall, and, as you might expect, let some of the passers-by be talking, and others silent. You're describing a strange scene and strange prisoners. They resemble us," I replied. "Now consider what would happen if the course of nature brought them a release from their fetters, and a remedy for their foolishness, in the following manner. Let us suppose that one of them has been released and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck round and walk with open eyes toward the light. And let us suppose that he goes through all these actions with pain, and that the dazzling splendor renders him incapable of discerning those objects of which he used formerly to see the shadows. What answer should you expect him to make, if someone were to tell him that in those days he was watching foolish phantoms, but that now he is somewhat nearer to reality, and is turned toward things more real, and sees more correctly? Above all, if he were to point out to him the several objects that are passing by, and question him, and compel him to answer what they are, should you not expect him to be puzzled, and to regard his old visions as truer than the objects now forced upon his notice? Yes, much truer. Hence, I suppose, habit will be necessary to enable him to perceive objects in that upper world. At first, he will be most successful in distinguishing shadows. Then he will discern the reflections of men and other things in water, and afterwards the realities. And after this, he will raise his hands and his eyes to encounter the light of the moon and stars, finding it less difficult to study the heavenly bodies and the heaven itself by night than the sun and the sun's light by day. Doubtless. Last of all, I imagine he will be able to observe and contemplate the nature of the sun, not as it appears in water or on alien ground, but as is in itself, in its own territory. Of course, his next step will be to draw the conclusion that the sun is the author of the seasons and the years, and the guardian of all things in the visible world, and in a manner the cause of all those things which he and his companions used to see. Obviously, this will be his next step. Now this imaginary case, my dear Glencon, you must apply in all its parts to our former statements by comparing the region which the eye reveals to the prison house, and the light of the fire therein to the power of the sun. And if, by the upward ascent and the contemplation of the upper world, you understand the mounting of the soul into the intellectual region, you will hit the tendency of my own surmises, since you desire to be told what they are, though, indeed, God only knows whether they are correct. But, be that as it may, the view which I take of the subject is to the following effect. In the world of knowledge, the essential form of good is the limit of our own enquiries, and can barely be perceived. But when perceived, we cannot help concluding that it is in every case the source of all that is bright and beautiful. In the visible world, giving birth to light and its master, and in the intellectual world dispensing immediately and with full authority truth and reason, and that whosoever would act wisely, either in private or in public, must set this form of good before his eyes. But in this passage, as throughout most of Plato's teaching, there is an identification of the good with the truly real, which became embodied in the philosophical tradition and is still largely operative in our own day, in thus allowing a legislative function to the good. Plato produced a divorce between philosophy and science, from which, in my opinion, both have suffered ever since and are still suffering. The man of science, whatever his hopes may be, must lay them aside while he studies nature, and the philosopher, if he is to achieve truth, must do so the same. Ethical considerations can only legitimately appear when the truth has been ascertained. They can and should appear as determining our feeling toward the truth, that our manner of ordering our lives in view of the truth, but not as themselves dictating what the truth is to be. There are passages in Plato, among those which illustrate the scientific side of his mind, where he seems clearly aware of this. The most noteworthy is the one in which Socrates, as a young man, is explaining the theory of ideas to Parmenides,